What better way to celebrate the imminent arrival of spring than with a serenade? And the works on this program all explore the idea of a spring serenade in a variety of ways, both obvious and subtle. And they also reveal webs of connections and conversations between their composers. One of the first things that immediately comes to mind about these works is that they're things that you don't typically hear on a performance by the Des Moines Symphony. In fact, 2 of the works have never been performed by the orchestra before, and the other 2 works have been performed each only once by the orchestra, one in 1986 and the other in 1961. The first 3 works on the program are also tied together by the fact they explore common musical traditions and they put them in dialogue with their predecessors as they continue to explore new musical territory. Both Strauss's Serenade and Gounod's Petite Symphonie are rooted in the harmony music tradition that thrived during Mozart's time and that paved the way really for all subsequent chamber music for winds. In the 18th century, it was common for aristocrats to keep in their employ a group of wind musicians, usually 5 or 6 players, that would perform for outdoor events. Eventually, there were more experiments with the ensemble, and it began to stabilize as a group of about 8 players, typically 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, and 2 horns. This group was called a harmony. Their repertoire usually consisted of popular tunes, arrangements of popular tunes and opera arias, things like that, for light entertainment. But several leading composers, including Mozart, wrote serious original work for these combinations. Mozart wrote a series of what are called wind serenades, most famous of which is the Serenade number 10, or also known as the Grand Partita for 13 instruments. So it's no accident that Strauss turns to Mozart's Grand Partita as a model when he composes his Serenade in E-flat. In fact, he employed almost the exact same instrumentation and composed the work almost exactly 100 years after Mozart wrote his Serenade. Similarly, Gounod does not title his work Serenade. He calls it Petite Symphonie or a Little Symphony, but it is clearly channeling Mozart's Serenades, and therefore it too is essentially another serenade on this program. It's also worth noting that 2 of the scores on this concert were composed by 17-year-olds. And while this may seem astonishing to many of us today, it's not quite so surprising when you consider that both Strauss and Mozart were children of highly accomplished musicians who saw to it that they had exceptional musical training and began composing at an early age. So by their late teens, they were capable of crafting quite sophisticated music, yet they really hadn't reached their full potential, and their greatest work would still lie some years in the future. It can be noted that even prodigy composers rarely create true masterpieces in their teens. There are some notable exceptions, such as Mendelssohn's Octet for Strings or his Midsummer Night's Dream Overture, but such examples are few and far between. I'm reminded of a master class I attended some years back with American composer Philip Glass. A young student inquired about the possibility of finding one's unique voice as a composer, and Glass quickly dismissed the idea of finding such a voice prior to even the age of 35, saying, quote, "Mozart, Schubert, Mendelssohn, forget about them. They're not real people." But in this case, we are hearing music by 17-year-olds who revealed wisdom well beyond their ages, and it gives us a glimpse of marvelous things to come. Usually when we think of the music of Richard Strauss, what comes to mind immediately are the tone poems and operas with their adventurous Wagnerian-style harmony and extraordinarily virtuosic demands on the musicians. But the influence of Wagner wasn't there in his earlier works, and in fact it only came about as a result of some degree of deception. Richard's father, Franz Strauss, was indeed well acquainted with Wagner's music, as he served as the first hornist in Wagner's orchestra, but the two of them did not get along. Franz Strauss was essentially disgusted by Wagner and his modern music, and evidence seems to suggest that Wagner, while recognizing the extraordinary skill of his hornist, reciprocated the negative feelings, even going so far as to intentionally compose brutally taxing first horn parts to torment Franz Strauss. So while Franz ensured that the young Richard was exposed to music of the past, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, he forbade him to study Wagner. Eventually, young Richard snuck in a score to Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, unleashing the floodgates to these new horizons. But his Opus 7 Serenade comes right before these glorious revelations would take hold. Years later, he would essentially dismiss the Serenade as the work of a competent student composer, but doing so is really selling this work short. Strauss models his serenade after the instrumentation of Mozart's Serenade No. 10, with the notable replacement of Mozart's double bass with a contrabassoon, which makes this work a score for all wind instruments. Although in the score he does include that one could replace the contrabassoon part with a double bass or even a tuba if the performers prefer. The orchestration shows that he is indeed the son of a horn player. He has clearly a strong command of wind instruments, their capabilities, and how they can work in various combinations to magnificent effect. Throughout the work, Strauss experiments with various sub-ensembles, quartets and sextets, smaller groups of the large ensemble that allow him to explore brilliant textures and colors that only hint at the orchestration that's going to be coming in his more mature works. The overall scale of the work is Mozartian, but the harmonic palette is rich in the Mendelssohnian vein, and his luscious sense of melody foreshadows the treats that lie ahead in his later operas. The title Petite Symphonie seems to suggest that Charles Gounod is going to be offering up a work for full orchestra. But in fact, it's more tied into the harmony music tradition because it calls for only 9 wind instruments and there are no strings at all. Symphony here refers more to the form of the work and the classical era German symphonic scheme that we'll recognize from, for example, the symphonies by Joseph Haydn, consists of 2 fast outer movements that frame 2 inner movements, one slow one and one that's a scherzo. The instrumentation is the familiar harmony music combination with the notable addition of a single flute part. The work was commissioned by the great French flutist Paul Toffanel, who was eager to expand the repertoire for chamber music for winds, especially in the wake of some serious innovations that had taken place across the course of the 19th century in technology for these instruments. Notable among these were the development of new systems for keys for woodwind instruments and the development of valves for brass instruments that made it capable for them to play across the entire range with equal tone qualities. Toffanel established a society of music for chamber music for wind instruments in 1879 that was devoted to expanding the repertoire and pushing boundaries, increasing the status of music for wind ensembles. And among other things, he would have new works commissioned each year to feature alongside works that were standard in the repertoire. And Toffanel himself was a notable composer. His Wind Quintet in G minor is among the true gems of works for that combination of instruments. So Gounod definitely wanted to feature the flute in this score. And although it's not on this program, the second movement is essentially an opera aria that features the solo flute throughout. So we'll be hearing the three livelier movements on this concert, each of which demonstrates Gounod's delightful gift for colorful orchestration and musical drama. He is, after all, primarily known as a composer of opera, and the qualities that drive the operas also drive this work. The use of only wind instruments definitely adds a degree of excitement throughout the work. And in the scherzo movement, we are reminded that the wind ensemble was originally intended for outdoor use, especially as the horns provide boisterous calls that are reminiscent of hunting scenes. Mozart's 25th is really the earliest of his symphonies that shows up on orchestra programs with some regularity. And this is at least partially due to its masterful use in Milos Forman's film Amadeus. Indeed, there is a lot to be said about the way Forman uses the first movement of the symphony in the opening scenes of that film. And while I don't have time to go into that in depth in the current conversation, I do invite you to join me for the Des Moines Symphony's Classical Conversations on Wednesday, March 17th, where I will be discussing in some depth the way Forman uses the symphony in that film. As the work of a 17-year-old, the symphony doesn't quite yet reach the degree of innovation, of subtlety, of sophistication that Mozart's going to reveal in his final symphonies, but it definitely shows his precocious sense of drama that is going to serve him very well in his subsequent work as an operatist. The symphony opens with a driving melody in syncopation that is followed by musical fireworks as arpeggios rocket upwards and burst into ornaments. Then, after a brief, tense silence, and in a masterful stroke, Mozart brings back that opening melody, but this time it's soft and it's dominated by a lonely solo oboe that gradually winds things down into yet another silence. Suddenly, that dark, tumultuous minor key opening is shattered as the music explodes into a major key fanfare, and we're taken on yet another wild ride. These kinds of contrasts and surprises are going to continue throughout the movement. One rather unusual aspect of this symphony is Mozart's use of 4 horns instead of the usual pair that are most common in the vast majority of classical era symphonies. There are at least 3 reasons for this choice. One is that it appears that Mozart was inspired to write this symphony after encountering Joseph Haydn's Symphony No. 39, which Mozart had found when he had been in Vienna recently. That work is also in the unusual key of G minor and calls for 4 horns. Another more important reason has to do with the valveless horns that were in use at the time. On a horn such as this, there are only certain notes that can be played open, that is, without manipulating the right hand in the bell. And so, in order to get a different set of open notes, a player would have to change out the crook and put in a different length crook to pitch the instrument in a different key. In order to get a different set of open notes, a different length of crook is necessary. So by calling for 4 horns, 2 pitched in B flat and 2 pitched in G, Mozart has essentially 2 horn sections and much more flexibility in which open notes can be played at any given time. Finally, he also does make use of 4-note chords with all of the horns. It gets a richer and more powerful effect as a full brass section, and that works magnificently in this fiery symphony. When we hear music by Frederick Delius, we encounter the art of a man who has had so many varied influences, it's really difficult to pin him down to a certain national or regional style as a composer. English conductor and Delius champion Sir Thomas Beecham really wanted to claim him as an English composer, and indeed he was born in England, but he also spent much of his life outside England with stints in Florida, Germany, and many, many years in France. He was also heavily influenced by Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg, and his parents were German, so he had a lot of influences throughout his life from other countries. On hearing the first Cuckoo in Spring even uses a folk melody that was used by Grieg as well in a set of piano works, but it too may have actually been introduced to Delius by Australian composer Percy Grainger. Whatever the influences, on hearing the first Cuckoo in Spring is an achingly beautiful piece that drips with nostalgia and imagery. It results from a blend of an English pastoral style music and European romantic and impressionist harmonies. The early spring call of the male common cuckoo has been a source of inspiration for composers for centuries. In fact, one of the earliest extant examples of English polyphony, the Middle English round Summer is a comin' in, refers to the call of the cuckoo.
Sing cuckoo, no, sing cuckoo, sing cuckoo, no, sing cuckoo, summer is a comin' in, summer is a comin' in.
Other famous example includes Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, Humperdinck's Hansel und Gretel, and Mahler's First Symphony, which famously features the call of the cuckoo dropping by a fourth rather than the more familiar interval of a third. Delius' score is so specific that he actually writes the word cuckoo above the clarinet part when it introduces that haunting call. And better yet, Delius did his ornithological research for this composition because the call he uses is indeed that of the earliest call in the spring. The male common cuckoo begins with that call, but over the course of the spring it becomes wider and wider in interval and eventually starts to resemble that of Mahler's cuckoo, reaching the interval of even up to a fourth. By summer, it changes directions and sometimes starts to go upward, and then it stops altogether, and we have to wait until the next spring to have that familiar haunting call return. To learn even more about the music on this program, as well as the composers and historical context for each work, please check out Richard Rhoda's program notes in the digital program book. And now I invite you to join us, the Des Moines Symphony Orchestra and Maestro Joseph Giunta, for Spring Serenade.